Thank you to the Symposium Committee for having me. I'm excited to present my research, The Afterlife of Charles Dickens, His Posthumous Impact on 19th-Century Spiritualism. Charles Dickens famously wrote that Jacob Marley was dead as a doornail, a metaphor that did not follow Dickens to his own grave. Like Marley, Dickens's own ghost came back to haunt readers as new stories published by the spirit pen of Charles Dickens started to become popularized in the spiritualist press. Dickens's name was frequently used in spiritualist newspapers to give credence to, or argue against, specific spiritualist messages. Notably, the most intriguing use of Dickens's name in the spiritualist community was through the American medium T.P. James. James quickly became known as Dickens's medium when he published Part Second of The Mystery of Edwin Drood in 1873, as written by the spirit pen of Charles Dickens. James's manuscript was repeatedly published either in part or in full in spiritualist newspapers and magazines in America and the UK. It was crucial to James and the spiritualist press that readers should believe that the spirit pen was indeed Dickens's own voice, so that the work would be accepted by the spiritualist community and beyond, helping that community to grow and thus extending the reach of spiritualism. James blatantly states on his title page that Part Second was published by the spirit pen of Charles Dickens through a medium, and that the medium is embracing also that part of the work which was published prior to the termination of the author's earth life. Dickens's name here is important not only to James, but to the spiritualist community to spread their message. James sets out this argument in the author's preface, purporting to be a message from Charles Dickens, which precedes the medium's preface. James writes, "The day is not far distant when millions who now believe it a delusion, and when that day comes, the world will be the better for it. And thousands who are in this happier world, and those who are yet to come, will be glad to know that the dear ones they have left behind regard their absence as a blessing certain." Here James, using Dickens's persona, is encouraging the audience to believe in the central message of spiritualism, which is that understanding and believing in the supernatural will lead to a happier existence because of the certainty of seeing loved ones in the afterlife. However, it is important to note that this message in the entirety of the author's preface goes against Dickens's own skepticism about spiritualism while he was alive. In Household Words, Dickens states that all such narratives must be received with the greatest circumspection and sifted with the utmost care. Nothing in them must be taken for granted, and every detail proved by direct and clear evidence before it can be received. Although his own skepticism might have worked against James's claims for authenticity, James used that skepticism to help validate his claims. The success of James's spiritualist messages and the impact they might have on the spiritualist community relied on the audience's belief in the authenticity of his manuscript. That authenticity relied more on James emulating Dickens's writing style than creating believable plot points. James's first attempt at recreating this authenticity begins with a dedication from Dickens to the poor at the commencement of his narrative. He writes, "The honest poor of every land who are now held by the iron hand of poverty, but who shall one day stand side by side with the highest on earth, these pages are dedicated, by the author, with the assurance that the happiest hours of his earthly existence were those that witnesses the success of these efforts to make their lives less burdensome, or when he had contributed by word or deed to their welfare and happiness." Dickens was an established social advocate for the lower classes. His charity and activism were well documented. So starting Part Second with an inscription to the poor created a sense of authenticity by imitating Dickens's own altruism, providing the spirit of Dickens with his own agency apparently separate from James. Giving Dickens his own apparent agency to speak directly to his audience through both the dedication and the author's preface added a layer of authenticity to Part Second that the narrative itself lacked. From this point, James's attempts at authenticity become less successful. In the medium's preface, James declares that he is an uneducated man, who is therefore not qualified to deny or admit the existence of grammatical errors in its composition, while affirming in the sentence before that the manuscript is given to the public word for word as it came to me. James presents himself as an uneducated man incapable of writing the quality of manuscript he produced, which creates a new layer of authenticity that goes beyond the agency of Dickens. Emphasizing his lack of education makes the similarities between James's half of the novel and Dickens's half more believable. It is likely that James is counting on his readers assuming that an uneducated man could never imitate Dickens's writing style successfully. So James bringing up his lack of education to his audience supports the plea for authenticity. The October 1873 issue of the Spiritual magazine reprinted an article that appeared in the Springfield Daily Union in July of 1873 on Part 2 of Edwin Drood. The article notes that, while James is by no means unintelligent or illiterate, he has no training whatever for literary work and has manifested no bent way, having never written before even so much as a newspaper paragraph for publication. Whereas Dickens had a lifetime of writing practice, James supposedly had none. The Springfield Daily Union's interview was widely circulated amongst the spiritualist press, appearing in publications like the Spiritual magazine, which was said to have over 15,000 subscribers at its peak. According to that same article, James refused interviews by the larger presses in America and instead allowed the Springfield Daily Union to be the first to whom he had related this strange story, because they allowed a skeptic to conduct the interview. James did not want his story placed in the hands of a magazine that would confirm his claims without investigating their authenticity. By the time the interview was over, the anonymous interviewer supported James's claims of authenticity and left the interview a believer. Therefore, when James went on to write his medium's preface, which had not been written at the time of the article's publication, his assertions of the legitimacy of the manuscript had already been readily supported by both a skeptic and multiple news outlets. The body of James's manuscript also runs into issues of authenticity that he was quick to explain to his readers. One stylistic feature that calls James's text into question were his Americanisms. Some critics claim that the writer was clearly American and used common American phrases throughout the novel. And while the British newspaper, The Spiritualist, did not outwardly discredit the authenticity of the manuscript, it did encourage readers to approach it skeptically, writing, "Whilst, therefore, the balance of evidence is strongly in favor of the genuineness of the narrative, the possibility of the whole being a Yankee hoax should be borne in mind." James predicted this form of criticism and was ready with an explanation for the American mannerisms critics claimed were included in the text. In Chapter 3 of Part 2, James writes that when she walked, she reminded one very forcibly of the walking beam of a steamer. Apparently, the term beam was deemed an Americanism by critics of James's manuscript. Responding to this alleged criticism, James added the following footnote. Some reliable authority, having criticized an extract that was taken from this work prior to its publication in book form, has stated it as his opinion that an English reader would fail to comprehend the term here given. With all due respect for the superior judgment of this reliable authority, whoever he may be, I shall beg to differ with him and give it as my opinion that if, in the United Kingdom, a man, woman, or child can be found who does not know what a walking or working beam is, in connection with marine engines, that man, woman, or child must have first seen the light of day in that country where Sir John Franklin last saw it, and must have been a very recent importation indeed. By calling attention to the American development of the British beam engine, James is drawing attention to a possible discrepancy of style between his narrative and Dickens's original. However, James's hope is that by pointing this out, he will retain the trust of his readers, especially those that follow spiritualism and are familiar with spirit writing. Arthur Conan Doyle writes in the History of Spiritualism that spirit writing was supposedly a cumbrous process. Thus, by rebutting any criticisms of Part 2 directly in the narrative, James tries to anticipate and disarm skepticism. And as Simon Natalie notes, practices of automatic and direct writing also contributed to the interaction of spiritualist print culture with spectacle and performance. James's outrage here, as well as in the medium's preface, at the authenticity of his manuscript being called into question, only played into the spectacle and performance that surrounded Part 2. Another issue with the authenticity of Part 2 arises when James's writing style is directly compared to that of Dickens. In the very first page of the manuscript, James refers to the character Jasper as the Jasper, and he does so multiple times throughout his narrative. James writes, "Mingled doubt and surprise come upon the Jasper face. Astonishment seems to have paralyzed the Jasper lips." Dickens never refers to Jasper in this way in his original novel. James's placement of the title "the" before James's name only draws attention to the importance of Jasper in James's narrative. Although no one knows how Dickens planned to end Edwin Drood, it has been inferred by many literary scholars that Dickens had intended Jasper to be Edwin's murderer, which is almost how James ended his version. Andrew Smith observes that Edwin Drood's demise is probably not so mysterious, given that Dickens made it clear to a number of his contemporaries that John Jasper was the murderer. Although Edwin was not dead at the end of Part 2, James is the antagonist and revealed as the intended murderer. Having suspected this, Edwin faked his own death. The article "the" placed before Jasper's name in Part 2 is an obvious and clumsy clue given to the reader of the significance and sinisterness of the character. Giving Jasper a title raises him above the other characters in Part 2. While Dickens drops subtle clues as to the mystery surrounding Edwin's disappearance, from the beginning of Part 2, James draws immediate attention to Jasper, making his important and Part 2's ending less of a mystery and more of a certainty. James continues to be unsuccessful in his attempts to recreate Dickens's writing style. A notable example is when he attempts to describe the passage of time from one chapter to the next. James writes, "One morning, just after the scenes narrated in the preceding chapter." Instead of portraying the time passing through a direct narration as Dickens would have done, James writes reflexively, drawing attention to his narrative technique. Dickens is one of the great examples of writing in a show-don't-tell style. In Edwin Drood, the passage of time from one chapter to the next was handled with more finesse by Dickens than the one given by James. Dickens writes, "John Jasper, on his way home through the close, is brought to a standstill by the spectacle of stony journals, dinner bundle and all." Here, Dickens shows Jasper on his way home from Mr. Sapsea's, indicating the passage of time since the conclusion of the previous chapter. Readers can infer it is early evening because of the dinner bundle. James, however, does the opposite in his writing and tells his readers where they are in the narrative instead of showing them. Another example of this comes a few chapters later, where James incorporates himself and the readers directly into his narrative to tell the readers where they are going. James narrates, "We will go in through the street door, which is seldom closed, and ascend a flight of stairs that once boasted of a railing, but is now shorn of that useful appendage. Ascending the stairs and gaining the landing from some 3 or 4 doors, we will select the one in the darkest corner and enter." Instead of showing the readers this through direct narration, James chooses to set the scene by telling the readers not what the characters are doing or seeing, but what they, the readers, should be seeing. However, this departure from Dickens's style might have been done intentionally to connect to the spiritualist reader. The lack of a show-don't-tell writing style by James created a stronger relationship between author, reader, and novel. James placing himself and his readers into the text using the word "we" creates a textual community with his readers by placing them in the narrative itself. The first-person pronoun allows the reader, along with the writer and the character, to become subsumed into the narrative. Although James's use of the word "we" here is inauthentic to Dickens's own style, it is paramount in creating a community of readers who think about the text in the spiritualist context that James is striving to achieve. Part 2 of The Mystery of Edwin Drood is only one example of spirit writing from Charles Dickens found in the 19th-century spiritualist press. After publishing Part 2, James founded his own spiritualist newspaper, the Summerland Messenger, which showcased new stories from the spirit pen of Charles Dickens, such as the story of a humpback's pilgrimage and the life and adventures of Broccoli Wickleheap. Although these stories did not have the same implicit spiritualist undertones as Part 2, they were surrounded by other articles, both in the Summerland Messenger and in other spiritualist periodicals that did. Celebrity author spirit writing continued to be an essential method of distributing spiritualism to the masses. Claims that authors such as Shakespeare, Milton, Robert Burns, and Conan Doyle had published new content from the spirit pen of mediums was a common occurrence in the spiritualist press. All of these new works had one thing in common: not their stylistic authenticity, but their apparent evidence to corroborate the central spiritualist message, that the dead can be contacted from beyond the grave, and that they retain an active interest in the activities of the living. Celebrity writers supposedly corroborating the message of spiritualism brought in new readers and believers to this emerging community.